Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last class of the series. Very exciting. And I was mentioning before that I was looking. So for this class, I kind of went over all the different topics we've done, and we've done a lot. We've done nearly 30 classes on Bible in the Ancient Near East. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just to remind you, I'm just going to quickly read the topics, and then we're going to go back and kind of talk about certain themes that we saw in the topics. Okay. So here we go. So we started with Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, and we also looked at early written languages in the ancient Near East. We looked at Akkadian, Ugaritic, how those work differently, how Ugaritic is an alphabet and much closer to kind of an early version of Hebrew. I am going to pause and ask everyone to make sure you're muted. And then we went on to Adam and Eve and Enkidu. We looked at the Adam and Eve story, what it says about civilization, and Enkidu and Gilgamesh. We looked at the flood in Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. We looked at the Canaanite pantheon. We looked at ancient Near Eastern law, what it tells us the stories about Hagar and Dinah. We looked at, and we're going to go back over all of this. I just want to remind you. We talked about Avram's dialogue with God compared to Hittite king prayers and what it says about collective punishment. The Teraphim. What could the Teraphim be? We looked at Nuzi, and we also talked a little bit about Nuzi adoption laws, talking about getting out of debt in the ancient world, what that tells us about the Shemitah rules, the biblical Shemitah rules, Akhenaten, the monotheistic pharaoh, common and written law. We looked at how law codes work in the ancient Near East, what that says about biblical law, trials and the role of the king compared to the Bible, war and ethics, Edom and the destruction, circumcision and oaths under the thigh, which, by the way, is my most popular class on YouTube by far. Everyone wants to see me talk about circumcision and oaths under the thigh. We talk about Persian Empire and its influence on Judaism and also in the Bible. Megillat, then we had a separate class specifically about Megillat Esther, Persian parallels and chronology. We looked at ancient inscriptions in the Bible, Mernaptah, the Mesha Stele, Tel Dan, and Sancheriv, wisdom literature in the Bible and the ancient Near East, Egypt and the Exodus, chronology, the Kadesh inscriptions and Egyptian parallels. We looked at Bil'am and the Deir Allah inscription, prayer in the Bible and the ancient Near East. We looked at prophecy in Mari in the Bible. We looked at the covenant at Chorev and biblical canonization. That was a two-parter. So we looked at kind of the idea of that was more kind of Bible-centered. We looked at death and Sheol in the Bible and the ancient Near East. Looked at what the meaning of Shema Yisrael is when we look at in terms of ancient inscriptions about God's manifestations in different places. Or you could say the Israelite God's manifestation in different places. Names and naming in the Bible. Reactions to the destruction in Judea and Samaria, and we talked about blessings and curses in ancient Israel. I think that covers it. So if we go back, okay, what are the different things? What are the different kind of themes that we can see tying different ideas together? And I'm actually going to touch on different things that we covered this year and looking at what ancient texts and what we know about the ancient Near East how that informs and interacts with how we look at the Bible and our study of the Bible and of ancient Judaism. So what's one way what's one way that it can enlighten it? So if we look at, I think not everyone has muted themselves, so please mute yourselves. Make sure you're muted, everyone. There's some kind of a ringing in the background. I don't think it's from me. Okay. Thank you. So if we look at, for example, if we look at Adam and Eve and Enkidu, we go back to one of our early classes, right, where we said, what does this say about civilization? So we can take a look and say, let's do a straight compare and contrast, right? Straight compare and contrast. Let's say that what we're talking about Adam and Eve, with the Adam and Eve story, one of the things it's saying is what separates people from animals. And of course, that is there's an assumption there that that's what it means, right? That's my interpretation in a way. Just a second, I want to make sure that our connection is okay. Okay, it looks like it's all right. So if you go along with me in my interpretation, my assumption that that's a big part of what the Adam and Eve story is telling us. which is what when we have Adam, I'll remind you, okay, so Adam eats the fruit, Eve eats the fruit, Adam eats the fruit, and then what results are a bunch of kind of curses, which if we look at the curses are things that separate people from animals. Before the story, Adam is actually, all the animals are kind of trotted out before Adam to see if Adam's going to find a helpmeet, and of course he doesn't, because they're animals, right? But the idea is that you're close enough that you could even like think that. But by the end of the story, we have a series of things that have been proclaimed, which separate people from animals. They're going to have to grow their own food. Eve is going to give birth in pain, right? And consistently in tremendous pain, which is for most animals is unusual. All these certain things that separate people from animals are now part of the human experience. Where we have in Gilgamesh with Enkidu, he's a wild man. So what do you need to do to make him into a person? You need to give him beer and bring him a woman, right? And now he realizes that he's not a beast in the field; he is a human man. Right. So it's interesting what does that mean in terms of civilization? Actually, it's not like it's not so negative. The idea is beer is everyone. I'm going to say it again. Everyone, please mute yourselves. And if you want to ask a question, of course, you can unmute yourself. Feel free, but just while you're Enkidu, right? Beer, which takes a considerable amount of cultivation. It's not just a way to get drunk. You don't pick beer off a tree. You have to cultivate it. He's given beer. He's given bread. He's given, if I remember correctly, and a woman, right? A woman is going to remind this guy that he's a man, right? He's not a beast. A cow's not going to do it for him. So these are the things that in Gilgamesh makes a person, right? And whereas with Adam and Eve, it's a different way of looking at what makes a person, right? What makes a person is what they have to do to survive and to prosper is very different from an animal, and it sets it up as, but of course it's in a different context. So we can just do this kind of compare and contrast and say, is it really different, or is it this context of the story that's different? But then we get to something, a different way of using ancient Near Eastern literature, which is in the flood, where we actually see these real strong parallels. And then we're like, wait, is the biblical flood story actually reacting to the flood story as it would have commonly been perceived by its original audience? Its original audience would have known the Gilgamesh flood story or something like it. Are there elements in the biblical flood story that are actually responding to that? And that's how we can understand them, right? And that I propose perhaps is the reason why it says Vashem Sagar Bado, that God closed the ark after Noah, to tell you that Noah didn't trick someone by promising this guy who he knows is doomed a house in order to get him to close the ship after him. Noah is a good guy. He's not some kind of trickster. He was chosen to survive because he's good, not because he just got in good with a particular god, right? And that's a contrast, but it's a contrast that only works if we know the Gilgamesh story. I mean, if that's true, if what I just said is true, and you can absolutely argue it doesn't have to be, right? But you don't understand, what does that mean? Vashem Sagar Bado, and God closed it for him. And we understand in Gilgamesh that you have to kind of, someone outside the ship. Now we could just say, well, that's the context. You'd say, well, if Noah is doing this, and Noah is doing it on his own, so who's going to be able to close the ship from the outside? Only God can do it, right? But in the Gilgamesh story, he pays, and it's not Gilgamesh who does it, it's Utnapishtim, right? Utnapishtim pays off a guy, right, to kind of see him off, and he's like, I'll give you my house and all my stuff, right? Knowing that he's going to die. And he's very good about not telling anyone, giving everyone the wrong information, saying, oh, this is going to herald a great period of prosperity, right? And sneaking off. Whereas Noah, we don't have any sort of interaction. We have nothing where Noah is tricking anyone, right? So, but that only the lack of interaction actually in and it doesn't, of course, a medieval commentary strikes us as negative, whereas if you contrast it with the Gilgamesh version, or the Cherkas's version, it's actually a positive thing. We don't see him tricking anyone, so that he gets off scot-free. So that's another way of looking at it, saying, are these some of these stories, are they actually in the background of the biblical narrative? And we looked at the same way with the Canaanite pantheon, where we're saying, is the interaction between Avram and Elimelech Kohen Le'el Elyon, right? Who is he actually serving? Does he think of himself as serving the head of the Canaanite pantheon? And Avram is correcting him and saying, no. Really, you're serving Yukevavke, right? The Israelite God. You're serving the God who created heaven and earth, not who isn't the head of a pantheon. He's this God. That's who you're really serving. And that's also a question. Then we looked at some different legal things where we got interesting legal parallels or legal explanations behind biblical narrative. So, for example, when we're looking at the Dinah and Hagar stories, and we're saying, what's going on with the Dinah rape story? Why does he expect? What is the argument between Shem and Dinah's brothers? And you can take the ancient Near Eastern law about women and say, is this story perhaps, are they critiquing the law of the land, which would in fact have allowed this guy who raped her to say, now she's my wife, right? And they're like, no, you can't do that. It doesn't work that way. But that is the law of the land, an ancient Near Eastern law that pretty much works. Frankly, in biblical law, it works not that differently, right? But in Assyrian law, we don't have a lot. We only have one law code, remember, that deals with a virgin who gets raped, a non-promised virgin who gets raped. We only have one law code that deals with that. And the idea being that according to the law of the land, Shechem's got a lot of legs to stand on, right? Okay, I raped her, now I can marry her, right? And the brothers are like, no, such shall not be done, right? Not by us, right? Not in our family, right? So is this in the same way as Hagar? Why is Hagar sent away so that Ishmael can't inherit with Avram? We can understand that perhaps when we look at the Hammurabi Code, which seems to say that that an action must be made during the father's life to say that the second wife's son should inherit. Right. So he makes an action to send him away to show that no, this son is not going to inherit with Yitzchak. Right. Remember that he sends also Keturah's children away with gifts. That's another statement. During his wife, he sends the other kids away. Only Yitzchak is the true heir. We looked at with the Terafim, we looked a little bit in terms of some adoption laws in the ancient Near East. Was what Rachel doing, was this kind of some household god thing? She was making a statement of whose family was continuing. But with the whole problem then is, if you actually look at the biblical text, and again, here we see the limits of drawing these parallels, is that when you look at the biblical text, there's very little to tell you about the word Terafim. It's very hard to take Terafim and connect it to household gods and to anything specific, really. They seem, if anything, the most common thing they're used for is as divination objects. So here we have a situation where we'd like to say something based on the ancient Near East and this one story, but the Hebrew was kind of working against us, right? If we look at the occurrences of Terafim in the biblical story, it's kind of working against us. And so going back to and then in terms of again, when we looked at contrasting laws, and when we looked at common law and written law, when we looked at getting out of debt in the ancient world, we looked very much at comparing and contrasting laws in the ancient Near East and the laws that we see biblically, and also the way that they are applied. So, for example, we talked a little bit about how common law and how written law in the ancient world was not necessarily meant to be followed to the T. There wasn't quite the same concept we have today, where someone looks something up in the legal code and says, this is what we do. There was much more an idea of a tradition, and the judges would just pass down rulings, and there were some kind of principles, right? In which were written down by Hammurabi's. A lot, like I said, a lot of people think that Hammurabi's code, or at least there's an approach that presents that Hammurabi's code was written based on legal transcripts and not the other way around, right? And when you have legal cases, they never say as according to Hammurabi. Sometimes they agree with Hammurabi, and sometimes they don't. We can understand this in terms of biblical law and oral law, and I really do. I think that if you look at biblical law, you cannot understand it without some kind of interpretation somehow. It doesn't work, right? And the classic example of this, of course, being divorce, right? You have a way to get divorced, but you don't have a way to get married, right? So you know that they have a way to get married, but that's it. Everyone knows it, so it's not a big deal. You don't have to write it down, right? You just have to say you can get divorced, right? This is how you do it. But we looked at how the different ways that the law actually kind of plays out also in terms of, for example, when we looked at trials and the role of the king, right? Where we can see in stories, biblical stories, that what happens is that the king usually gets cases where if you applied the written law or applied the standard law, injustice would be done. At least that's the way that it's presented in our stories. So, the idea being where the case that comes to Shlomo is special because it's also a case where you have no way of deciding, right? You have these two women who are both prostitutes, so there's no other witness to say whose baby is whose, and they're both arguing over the same baby. And Shlomo, in his wisdom, where there's no evidence, creates evidence. That's a tremendous wisdom. The wisdom of Solomon, right? That he creates evidence from a situation where there is no evidence. But usually, right, where we see that, for example, Natan comes to David with his story. Here, this guy, and he had this lamb, and he loved this lamb, and this rich man next to him killed the lamb, and should he just get it right? And he says, no, kill that guy because he's done something so horrible. Or the other story with the wise woman of Tekoa, and also David, because this is apparently the way to trick David, that she comes and says, here I have two sons, one killed the other. And of course he is now guilty of murder. He must be killed. But if they kill him, I will have no sons. Please don't kill him, because then I will have no sons. So justice demands that the remaining son be killed for the murder of his brother. But the woman is coming saying, but then I will have no son. That is not justice for me. I lost one already. Don't take another one away. And that's why she's going to the king. She's going to the king because that's, where we don't really, and what we see in the ancient Near East, okay, I see some questions here. She's going to the king because if you just apply the law, she's going to lose both her sons, right? So she's going to the king to say, please don't apply the law in this case. You go to the king when actually applying the law is going to do an injustice, right? So that's the way it's being presented. Now, of course, it's a fake story, right? She's just faking him out because because Yoav wants him to forgive Avshalom, right? Which ends up being a terrible mistake, but put that aside, right? But that's the idea. When we see in the ancient Near East is the kings fulfilled a bunch of different functions when it came to trials. They could sometimes be appealed to. We don't see it much in a case where you don't apply justice, but I think there's at least one case that's like that in the ancient Near East, but it seems like that where you appeal to the king because the law is not working. So and that also, this just kind of fleshes out. So sometimes you can use the ancient. So what we've seen is, I'll go back. What we've seen is in some cases we could just do a compare or contrast. In some cases, we look at the ancient Near Eastern as a background to the biblical story or the biblical text. And other times it just kind of fleshes out what's going on in the area, right? Let's put this in context. What's happening in the area, right? And that's a similar thing to if we look at Akhenaten, right? Who's the monotheistic pharaoh, right? And he, of course, if you want to, you can connect him maybe to Yosef if you want to do chronologically, but it's very hard to connect him to what you could say biblical monotheism, even though again there are absolutely those who feel that probably he was influenced by Asiatics. There was a lot of a back and forth between the Canaan area and his kingdom, and before his kingdom, as I've mentioned, his father had a Semitic vizier who seemed to be polytheistic the same way. He didn't particularly not have a different burial. His burial plot also, praise the gods, etc., etc. Just a moment. And but what was interesting to me, if you actually look at the prayers of, in general, ancient Near Eastern and especially Egyptian prayers, or both really, they're very good at concentrating on one God. It's not that weird for you to see a prayer or a kind of a worship where when it's talking about that God's the best. That God's so powerful, that God's great. It's not that unusual. What's for me, what's still more surprising though, is this idea of an abstract God, because Akhenaten's God is the sun disk, and that really is a tremendous chiddush, and a tremendous innovation for Egyptian religion, to have something that's really in no way personified. It's not an animal, it's a sun disk with little arms giving things out, but it's a sun disk that's tremendously abstract. So that idea to have not only a single God, but a single very abstract God, you wonder, where did he get this idea? Even though his motivation could very well have been to take power away from the priests of Amun, who were getting very, very powerful. Right? I see a question, so go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Joel. Yeah, I don't hear you.
Yeah, hi. I think I brought this up before, but I'm going to use a term they used when I was a kid. They don't use the term anymore. They used to call people Agudnik professionals, like people who were Haredi, but who sometimes were aware of these questions. And then, they were usually college educated, Agudnik professionals. They would, the answer that they would bring was the yeshiva Shem, what is it? Shem Be'evel? Sorry, yeah, Evel, someone else. Yeah, but the idea that if they brought up, for example, about Gilgamesh, and that almost never came up. I heard it once. Again, these stories were really based on Noah and the traditions of the yeshiva Shem Be'ever, but they were sort of it was like broken telephone. So there was some recognition that there were these questions, to be positive. I'm not making fun of it, but it always came back. There was this idea, and it was very rare. Like I'm not saying that these people there weren't too many of these people. There were a few, and they were usually very reticent about discussing it. But and they were usually from Western countries like Holland, or they weren't from Eastern Europe usually. Okay. And but there was
question. Is there a question, or are you just commenting that this existed?
Yeah, that this existed even then, and they were Haredim. I mean,
well, they were educated, right? Oh, the comparison with ancient Near Eastern stuff goes way, way, way back in the Western world. Okay, so it had plenty of time to get to educated religious people, and in many countries, everyone was Haredi. There wasn't like if you were religious, you were what we would call today Haredi. We call ultra orthodox. Like there wasn't so you were educated, and you were, what else would you be? But so absolutely, Shem Be'ever can do a lot of heavy lifting, I guess. I don't like that. That's I generally, like, if someone comes to me, if I have a student who says to me, but couldn't it be that Gilgamesh is based on Noah? And I'd say, okay, you could try and read it that way. I found that there were certain things, and it was very distressing for me the first time that I saw some of these parallels, because some of the parallels, like for example, the repetition that you have in Noah and certain things with the numbers, saying how many days and how many, and it feels different from the rest of biblical narrative. And then you see it in Gilgamesh, right? Where exactly how many days and the repetition, and you're like, oh, it's here. And that I remember that the first time I read Gilgamesh, that's what I found really distressing, was actually the kind of the parallels in the style that I found very difficult to explain otherwise. But I am always happy to say, okay, go ahead. You could say this was based on Noah. You can absolutely say they're both based on a flood, right? So like, and you would not be there are scholars who say, what is this based on, right? So what happened that everyone's got a flood story, right? So that's also something to talk about. And that's always the thing with ancient Near Eastern stuff. And it's something that I get I try to be cautious about, but sometimes I'm not cautious enough, where you don't know, there isn't necessarily influence, you really don't know the direction. Dates are so different. Like I can be comparing something from Newsy and I'm comparing it with something from, completely different time, a completely different, like, because I just put, it's true, I just put things in this bucket that I call the ancient Near East, right? And it's this very long period of time and it's over quite a far area, but we do really see this back and forth. So if you're reading something in Akkadian, you're like, well, this is in Akkadian, so how did it get to where someone's in Northwest Semitic? But Gilgamesh was really copied over a lot. And also, and I'm not saying, and I don't like to take something like this and start talking about the divinity of the Torah based on it, because I do think, and this is one of the things that whenever I teach Tanakh, particularly in a religious context, I say, this is what I teach when I look at Pshat. One of the things I believe is that it meant something to the original audience. I believe it meant something to the original audience. In other words, the people who lived at the time understood it. It wasn't some mystery that only we understand, because now we've lived through, I don't know, Christianity, I think that it was meant to be understood by the first people who heard it. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in later interpretation. I believe, I'm talking about my personal beliefs, I believe very much in Shivim Panim La Torah. There's 70 faces to the Torah. And I believe that interpretations are valid in and of themselves. At the same time, one of them has to be the people who lived at the time. Right. I don't think, and there are a lot of times you don't know what I mean, but when a lot of times when you talk about prophecy or you talk about Yeshayahu and you're saying, okay, the second half of Yeshayahu, and they're like, why do you say the second half of Yeshayahu was written after Koresh? I'm like, well, it talks about Koresh, right? What did people before the Second Temple period, how would they have understood those verses? They didn't say, they weren't waiting for, like, how did they understand them? So if there's a text that's talking about something that the people at the time couldn't possibly understand, there's got to be, only if it's another meaning will I accept it as an interpretation. Like I won't accept something which could not possibly have been understood by the people at the time. At the same time, when I look at a story, I'm like, okay, the way I reconcile the Noach story and the Gilgamesh story is the initial audience of the Noach story knew the Gilgamesh story, or the base story, the core story they knew, not necessarily Gilgamesh, but they knew the Pishtim story. They knew that they knew the core thing, the core flood story. And there's certain things in the Noach story that are meant to fix that are not meant to correct that. Who is our perfect person? Right? Our perfect person is a good person that God likes because he's a good person, not because he's paying God off, right? And not because he's tricking everyone and, this God happens to be like, he kind of likes that, right? No, the God doesn't tell him how to trick humanity, right? Why does the flood happen? Because people are being bad. The whole world has gone corrupt. Right, and that's very clear. Now, I'm not saying that the ancient Near East, the fact that they're noisy, that may mean that they're sinning. It really may. If you read it in context, you're like, this really might mean that they're being bad, that people are being bad, they're being noisy, right? But it's still not a super emphasis. It's mainly seems like in the ancient Near Eastern story, the gods are really stupid because they kill off the people and then they start starving. It's like, what did you think was going to happen? If you need people to feed you, maybe don't kill them off, right? And they're like, oh, right. Bad idea. right? So that it really, the gods look kind of silly. And that's not what happens with the Noah story, even though he brings a sacrifice. The first thing he does as he reaches dry land is he brings a sacrifice, right? So you have these interesting parallels that kind of highlight the contrast.
Can I just interject?
Sure.
Yeah, I think I'm just to elaborate on what you're saying. I think maybe the central message here is Bishon Bnei Adam Dibrat Torah. These stories were out there. That was the milieu, and the understanding was that if you really want to educate people, maybe it's best not to start from scratch. Start with stories that are familiar with it to everybody, and put the punchline that you want on them.
Right. So you're taking what I said, a step further, right? Because you're saying like, oh, the whole reason, the whole story is a way to get this message across, right?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's certainly the way I look at Midrash. I don't know, and if I don't disagree with what you're saying. I would need to think about it before saying it myself. But yes, and I think especially like with the with Noah and even more like, and it's also there's a certain, I've spoken about this before, I think there's really an arc in the biblical narrative going from Adam and Eve to Noah as people are getting farther and farther and farther from animals, right? Where Noah, that's the break. In other words, the reason that people eat animals and people are absolutely not animals is because if we're that close to animals, then when people sin, the world's got to be destroyed. So you need this disconnect. And you get to a reconnect when the people of Israel go back to Israel. When the 12 tribes go back to Israel, and then they once more have a connection with the land, is if you do bad, the land will spit you out. And you haven't had that connection since before the flood, right? So there's a kind of an arc there. But that's so let me continue talking a little bit with highlights of this class that we've gone through. So with war and ethics, we see that not only that there are, when we talk about war and ethics, we looked at different attitudes toward how you should behave in war biblically, and we saw the context in the ancient Near East, where also there was this kind of a duality where you had some very what we consider really immoral, or I would say very harsh conquest practices, paired with certain letters that seem to indicate a care for captives. Don't worry, they're alive, they're well, they're fine. Which may be, just as slaves, but there is still an indication that things were not always that brutal throughout. Even though the Assyrian conquest did tend to be quite brutal. Edom and the destruction. We mentioned what role could Edom have played in the destruction, and there excuse me, there we're really just using the ancient Near Eastern text to kind of fill in a gap that we could try to fill in from the biblical text itself, namely Edom caught escaping Judeans, right, who were trying to escape from the Babylonian conquest. So Edom seems to have caught them and handed them over. They rejoiced in the defeat, which for Judeans who considered them relatives was very painful. But given the history of Edom as being a vassal state of Israel, was a kind of somewhat understandable. And also this idea that Edom was taking chunks of Judean territory while they were being attacked from the north. And that we actually see from letters that we have from fortresses that were taken over by Edom from the Israelite, or rather Judean side. We looked at circumcision and oaths under the thigh. Enough about that. I already got to my limit on that one. Actually, no, we looked at how they're different. Circumcision is different was possibly different in Egypt and in the ancient Near East and in Judaism, and that would explain certain biblical texts we have in terms of having a circumcision again. the Persian Empire in the Bible and Megillat Esther, we looked at certain parallels in terms of, we looked at how the Persian Empire actually influenced later biblical books, the biblical books that were written in the Return to Zion after Jesus had lived, which written during the Persian period, when there was substantial influence, it seems, of certain aspects of Persian culture and Persian thought on Jewish thought, and that continued during the Persian period and into the Second Temple period. Explains certain texts and a heightened interest in angels and demons as we get to later in Judaism. We looked at ancient inscriptions in the Bible. We kind of looked at a whole range of inscriptions that kind of mention God, mention Israel, and how they fit into kind of biblical chronology, etc. Wisdom literature, we talked about the parallels that we have between different approaches. And here, actually, I wanted to take a pause and say, and kind of go back a little, that another thing that putting things in the context of the ancient Near East can do for us is it can highlight certain theological questions. That's one of my favorite things to kind of look at, and look at, say, what are the theological questions that everyone is dealing with. So if we go back to the dialogue that Avram has with God and the Hittite king prayers, I'll remind you, are prayers by a king to the gods, right? That are trying to stop a plague, right? And he knows darn well how the plague got in. It got in through sailors who came in, and he, from what I remember, the sailors went and they came back and they brought in the plague. So he knows how the plague came in naturally, but there's your standard dual causality. Yeah, okay, there's a natural cause, and then there's the divine cause. And the gods are not happy, they're not getting rid of this plague. And one of the things he says is, don't let, everyone suffer for the sins of a few. Essentially, there are a few people, there may be, because he's just grasping at anything. He has no idea what it is. He's like, we'll bring you sacrifices, and then he says, I know my father sinned, but I didn't sin, so don't take it out on me. Or he says, don't hold the sins of just a few, right? Don't hold that against the many. Another argument he brings is, you guys like sacrifices, right? Well, you're killing off all the people who bring you sacrifices. That's another argument that he uses. But the argument that don't punish everyone for the sins of a few is very much parallel to Avram's argument with God. But the idea is that there is this principle of don't, or you shouldn't. This is something that happens, but please don't do it, right? But at the same time, in Avram's dialogue, we have a much greater emphasis on there's an ethical principle at stake. There's an ethical principle that is, as it were, above God, right? God's, he's like, you're right, because he's the judge of everything. Won't he do justice? And what is justice? Justice is not to kill not to kill the good with the bad, right? So it's a little bit different with it, but it's a similar argument. Actually, I wasn't quoting the Hattie letter correctly. That it's the the idea of don't let the good people die because of the sins of the bad, right? And that's what Avram is saying. But he's saying it in very much the context of there's a principle here. God visits Avram, and it seems like it's possible that God's visiting Avram, so Avram applies the principle to God, right? Because Avram needs to know. Shouldn't Avram know what I'm doing, right? Why does Avram need to know what he's doing? Because he needs to know how things work, and he does, right? There's a principle that you shouldn't kill the good with the bad if it can be avoided, right? And that's a principle that he's applying. But this is an idea that we see beyond biblical thought, even if we see it in a more minor way. The same way we see things like in terms of prophecy. When we looked at prophecy and Mary in the Bible, we had the same thing where prophets are like, don't do it. Don't do it. This is a bad idea. They're making a political statement. They're like, don't ally with these guys. You can't trust them. And he allies with them and it doesn't end well. And it's like, It's just like a biblical prophecy. It's just like a good old political biblical prophecy where the prophet's like, don't do it, and he does it, and then bad things happen, right? So you have these, but what you don't have so much that we have, we at least don't have the remnants so much of non-political prophecies to kings, not at least not to a great extent in the ancient Near East. In general, if they were writing it down, it was a political prophecy, and that's why they needed a record of it. So we looked at, and we also looked at Bilam and the Deir Allah inscription. That was a classic. This is Bilam and the Deir Allah inscription and the Kadesh inscriptions are both cases that I found, at least in teaching this class, were a parallel that was disappointing, right? So you have Bilam, Bilam is mentioned, but there's not a lot you can do with this parallel. The Bilam inscription, he's bringing, yes, the rhythm of some of it is similar maybe to the Bilam section of the Bible. He's talking about something else. He's saying this thing about death. He's predicting doom and gloom, but it's not a curse. It's not a blessing. It's not really connected to much of anything that we could do it in biblical account. The Kadesh inscription is interesting. It's interesting in that when you compare it, if you want to compare it to Az Yashir, right, to the Song of the Sea, if you want to compare it to Az Yashir, then you can say, well, it's got a mix of poetry and prose and recounting a battle. That's pretty much what you can say. There's not a lot. It doesn't really seem very, very parallel to Az Yashir, even if you can kind of draw some imagery parallels. It generally does not. It doesn't really jive so much. You really have to push it. Still, they're interesting to find, and we do have that the proposed parallel between the Pharaoh's camp at Kadesh and the structure of the Mishkan, which you can do with what you will. The covenant, we talked about the covenant of Horeb and biblical canonization. Again, that was mainly talking about biblical stuff itself. Canonization comes up, I assume, the next time I teach, someone also is going to ask me again about canonization. I like talking about it, but there's a lot there. And when we talked about Persia, we also talked about the end of prophecy, and that's a very big part of kind of, it seems like the experience of Shivat Zion, of the return to Zion, is this recognition that prophets are not particularly reliable. And that's kind of the beginning of the end, and prophecy seems to continue, really, right? Because we talked about Nehemiah having a prophet that he doesn't believe in, a prophet that he calls a prophet, and he's like, you're just trying to trick me, you're lying, right? Now, once you have something like that, and a person feels absolutely comfortable saying this prophet is just totally lying, and he's a regular guy, and Nehemiah is a regular guy, he's like, you're lying, you're trying to set me up, you can already see why prophecy is kind of gone, right? And why prophecy is kind of just very close to dead. Okay, so now I do know that Josephus talked about much later the Essenes being prophets, right? We don't really see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they call themselves prophets. In fact, whenever they use the term prophecy, they use it in connection to false prophets. It's something that other people do. The other groups do that. So there seems to be an understanding that prophecy is over once we get to the Second Temple period, once we get to well into the Second Temple period. I'm going to pause because I see a couple of questions and comments. Question from Danny and Libby. Remind me, did Edom bite off chunks of Yehuda during the Assyrian conquest or Babylonian, or both? Well, I was talking about the Babylonian conquest. I don't know. I don't remember about during the Assyrian conquest. But I was talking about during the Babylonian conquest. The king's statement that this is from Susan, the king's statement that the gods will be harming themselves by killing off the people that bring them sacrifices reminded me of when Moshe, when pleading for Bnei Israel, said that the destruction of the Israelites will make it look like God is not powerful enough to fulfill his promise to bring the Israelites to the promised land. God punishing humans is against God's own self-interest. God has a stake in the survival of God's people. Yes, that is absolutely a parallel. And just to remind you that in Hazinu, right, when you have, it's right at the very end of Devarim, and this is kind of the prophecy of what's going to happen. The reason that God has mercy and brings and God has mercy on the nation in the end is simply because of what the other nations are going to say. It's not because they're any good. So that's that argument with God is in the group of arguments where we're assuming that the people are crappy. People are crappy. What are you going to do? This is an argument you can use with God. What are the other nations going to say? You promised, right? Things like that. Those are when you want to say that's another way of saying that the people are just no good whatsoever. So going back to topics, death and Sheol in the Bible in the ancient Near East, we talked about how death is really in the Bible in particular is really not, Sheol is really not developed. And there's a question, as I believe Moshe Matitya at the time brought it up, there's a question whether Sheol is just death, right? Is it supposed to be a place? So Yechezkel describes it as a place, but he's already in Babylonia, right? He's in Babylon. So that he's already talking within that context anyway. And there's very little interest in death in the Bible as opposed to Egyptian thought, but in a way, to a certain extent at least, not that far from ancient Near Eastern thought. The ancient Near Eastern texts we do have texts that go a little bit more into detail, but the main thing is you don't come back. That's really the main part of it. It's not something that gets a lot of kind of mythology or interest. And in general, there's very little interest into what happens after people die until well into the Second Temple period, I would say. And even then, quite limited, because the main thing is everyone's in a holding pattern until the final apocalyptic end, where righteous people get to live forever, and then and wicked people don't, right? So there isn't much until we get even to after that. And of course, the idea of an afterlife, it solves the problem of punishment, of reward and punishment, because then you have a place to get rewarded and punished for things that you obviously didn't get rewarded or punished in life. Where the Bible, to a certain extent, solves that, at least in certain books, through intergenerational punishment. In other words, punishment is kind of stretched out over generations, etc. We talked about, and this is, I know not everyone agreed with me, but we talked about Shema Yisrael, the unity of God, and the idea that was common in the ancient Near East, that a manifestation of God in a certain place could actually kind of be treated as a different God in a way, or at least was talking, we're bringing a sacrifice to the God who is in Dan, to the God who is in, and that Shema as an expression of God's unity is speaking against that, and that we can understand the need to have only one temple also as an argument against that idea. We talked about names and naming in the Bible in the ancient Near East, how we can try at least to kind of date books by the names that they're using, and at least there was an attempt to do that. And also in terms of naming people, Moshe's name being very much parallel to how adopted children might be named in the ancient Near East. In other words, Kimei Amayim Ishitihu, I pulled him from the water, right? Where they have, saved from the raven's mouth, things like that. And you might have a name like that, even though his actual name, Moshe, seems to be Egyptian for son, right? So we talked a little bit about that. Reactions to destruction in Judea and ancient Sumer. We looked at Lamentations throughout the, not really throughout the ancient Near East, particularly in Sumer, and we looked at it and we compared it with Eicha, and what is the function, where we really don't know what the function of the biblical Lamentations are, because they're not liturgical the way that the Sumerian Lamentations are. They don't fulfill a function of after it's being rebuilt. On the contrary, they seem to be rewritten when there was no rebuilding. There is no restoration. It's asking for restoration. And so there is a real question in terms of what function do they serve, and in terms of the power. We talked a little bit also about the power of Eicha. I'm biased because I just find biblical texts very, very powerful in general. With very few exceptions. I start reading biblical texts and I get very into them. And we did look also at blessings and curses in ancient Israel, and there we really looked at inscriptions that we have, texts that we have, with certain, we had, the priestly blessing, we have curses of someone in a cave, we have the verse in Zechariah where God seems to be using a formula, using his own name to get rid of the Satan. And we talked about how blessings and curses kind of played out later in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's been an exciting year where we've done a lot. I hope you enjoyed these highlights. So just to summarize, what we've seen is a number of ways that looking at ancient Near Eastern texts and artifacts can enrich our study of biblical texts. They can give us context, they can give us contrast, they can give us very thought-provoking parallels, they can open a door into theological issues that were important for everyone at the time. And they can also open a door to things that seem to be fairly specific to biblical thought, at least compared to the text that we have from the ancient Near East. So I hope that those ideas kind of came across this year for you guys. And I hope that you guys got something from this class and you enjoyed it. So thank you very much for joining me.